Breaking news. Putin has threatened to hold off on a new grain deal until the West agrees to his terms. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said on Monday that the historic agreement that allowed Ukraine to export grain safely through the Black Sea during the war will not be restored until the West meets Moscow's demands on its own agricultural exports. With his comments, Putin dashed hopes that the agreement, seen as crucial for global food supplies, could be revived after his talks with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. After a parallel agreement promising to remove obstacles to Russian food and fertilizer exports wasn't honored, Russia decided not to extend the deal in July. Although it has shipped more wheat than ever before, the government blamed trade barriers on shipping and insurance restrictions. Putin echoed these concerns, saying Russia could rejoin the agreement within days if these promises were kept. Defense Minister Zelensky is now out of a job. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has nominated Rustem Umerov to replace Alexei Reznikov as defense minister, saying that the ministry needs new approaches as the conflict with Russia enters its 19th month. Since the Russia-Ukraine war broke out on February 24, 2022, Reznikov has gained widespread notoriety. No arms came from South Africa to Russia. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has stated that there is no evidence, according to an independent investigation, that his country supplied arms to Russia during the ongoing conflict. According to Ramaphosa, statements from various sources have used these allegations to question South Africa's stance on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Not a paywall, as such. However, by registering, you help us cater to your interests and produce more reliable journalism for everyone. Major differences in foreign policy positions were highlighted in the first debate between Republican Party candidates for the U.S. presidential election in 2020. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and businessman Vivek Ramaswamy have voiced doubts about America's commitment to Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, in contrast to former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence and former U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley. Trump, the undisputed frontrunner and former president, skipped the event but has also voiced opposition to U.S. involvement in that conflict. The Republican base is just as politically divided as the candidates, according to the polls. The election of an isolationist Republican in 2024 raises concerns that this could signal a break with the post-World War II international order dominated by the United States. The public mood in the United States has historically swung between extremes of openness and withdrawal. Franklin D. Roosevelt, after seeing the disastrous results of isolationism in the 1930s, initiated the steps that led to the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944 and the United Nations in 1945. Truman's post-war policies cemented alliances and kept the United States military abroad indefinitely. The United States led the United Nations coalition that fought in Korea in 1950, spent heavily on European reconstruction through the Marshall Plan in 1948, and established NATO the following year. These measures were taken as part of a more realistic strategy to limit Soviet influence. But containment was understood in different ways, and later American debates over interventions in developing countries like Vietnam and Iraq were heated and partisan. While questions were raised about the morality of intervening, support for maintaining the liberal institutional order was met with much less opposition. The fortunate vagueness of liberal internationalism, as noted by American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, prevented it from becoming ideologically rigid. As a result, after World War II, the liberal international order had widespread support in American foreign policy circles. In contrast, Trump's claim that post-World War II alliances and institutions had benefited others at America's expense resonated strongly with many voters in the 2016 presidential election. Certainly, his support among the people wasn't based solely on his criticism of American foreign policy. In addition, he capitalized on racial tensions, women's empowerment, and the gender identity debate to win over voters who were frustrated by economic upheavals brought on by globalization and the Great Recession that followed 2008. But Trump successfully linked nativist resentment to U.S. foreign policy by blaming economic problems on bad trade deals with countries like Mexico and China and on immigrants competing for jobs. Trump wasn't the first to use such a strategy, of course. The roots of the populist backlash could be traced to the 1920s and 1930s. Many white Americans worried that they would be outnumbered after more than 15 million immigrants arrived in the United States in the first 2 decades of this century. The National Origins Act was passed in the 1920s with the help of a resurgent Ku Klux Klan in an effort to prevent the Nordic race from being swamped, and preserve a more traditional, homogeneous America. Similarly, the racial, ideological, and cultural divides that had been growing since the 1960s were reflected in Trump's election in 2016. Trump supporters argue that the administration's less generous and tougher stance produced greater stability abroad and support at home, despite the concerns of many analysts who fear that American retrenchment could lead to the kind of international disorder that plagued the 1930s. Whatever the case may be, the election of Donald Trump marked a decisive break with the liberal norm. Liberal elites, according to this theory, contributed to Trump's success by ignoring the people's true preferences. That, however, is an oversimplified explanation. While Americans as a whole may hold divergent views on foreign policy, elite circles tend to pay more attention to international issues. Still, we have a pretty good idea of the public's position over time. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs has been polling American opinions on whether or not to get involved in international affairs since 1974. About a third of the population has held a view of isolationism throughout that time, continuing a trend that dates back to the 19th century. This percentage peaked at 41% in 2014, but contrary to common belief, 2016 did not mark the pinnacle of isolationism since 1945. In 2016, 64% of voters said they favored U.S. involvement in international affairs. In 2018, that number jumped to 70%, the highest it's been since 2002. Many experts worry that a failure to support Ukraine could signal a return to American retrenchment, auguring a serious weakening of the international order, even though a return to full-scale isolationism a la the 1930s is highly unlikely. The invasion ordered by Russian President Vladimir Putin was a flagrant disregard for international law. To the extent that Russia is successful in occupying Ukrainian territory, it will have undermined the liberal principle against using force to alter the borders of a country. NATO's unity in imposing sanctions on Ukraine and providing the country with military equipment is, therefore, not only moral but also realistic. What happens in Ukraine will have far-reaching effects on Europe and the rest of the world. China has been hesitant to offer material support to Russia despite Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping entering a no-limits partnership just before the invasion. It's safe to assume that Chinese leaders are worried about the toll that the alliance is taking on Chinese influence abroad. But if Putin wins, China may decide that it was worth it to take those risks, and the rest of the world won't have missed the point. Those who claim the United States has no vital national interest in supporting Ukraine are ignoring the country's recent past. Because of their naivete, or even bad faith, they shouldn't even be considered for the presidency.